The top third of the tablet is gone. What remains 13 centimetres of baked clay, pale as afternoon sand, catalogue number CBS 673 in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, is the lower portion of something that once held more. The break is old and clean. It did not happen in transit from Iraq to Philadelphia, or during the dig, or in storage. The clay was already missing when the expedition uncovered it. The surface is the colour of late afternoon sand. Under the right light you can see where the stylus pressed harder on some lines than others, the wedges going slightly deeper where the scribe paused, or where the composition seemed to demand more. The tablet is smaller than you would expect, about the size of a man's hand held flat. Baked clay from Nippur. Dated by its script style to roughly 1650 BC, 2/3 of the original tablet has not survived. What remains is the lower third, 6 columns of text, 3 on each face, between 10 and 15 lines each. The scholars who examined it estimated that the complete original would have contained around 260 lines. What we have is perhaps 100. Those 100 lines tell us enough to know what we're missing. The surviving text picks up mid-story, with the gods An, Enlil, Enki and Ninhursag having already fashioned what the text calls the Usa-ig, the black-headed people, and having also made animals multiply everywhere and herds of 4-legged beasts exist in the desert. By the time we can read, the human beings and the animals are already present. The creation has already happened. The sequence, whatever order it followed, is gone with the broken upper edge. Wherever you're watching this tonight, Lagos, London, Melbourne, Mumbai, somewhere in the quiet hours between, drop where you are in the comments. Tell me what time it is there. This question, the one this broken tablet raises, belongs to all those places equally, and I want to know who's here for it. Because the Sumerians apparently felt it was important enough to record, copy and preserve across centuries. And it is a question worth sitting with, in a tradition that wrote down everything it thought mattered. What came before us? The 100 surviving lines of CBS 10673 do not answer that, but they tell us very precisely that the creation of humans was not the first act of the cosmos. The gods made things before they made us. The animals were already there, and the lines that would have told us what sequence the scribes believed was true those lines are sitting somewhere in the Mesopotamian soil. Or they dissolved back into the earth 3,000 years ago and we will not recover them. That is where this investigation begins, not with an answer but with a specific absence, a broken upper edge on a clay tablet slightly larger than your hand, and the fact that at least 4 other texts written in different cities in different centuries, in 2 different languages, describe the same basic sequence, each from its own angle, each with its own emphasis, and each placing humanity somewhere in the middle of the story rather than at its beginning. The tablet you cannot see is the most important one, but what survives tells us something precise enough to follow. When the gods came first, Thorkild Jacobson, who translated the Eridu Genesis for the Journal of Biblical Literature in 1981, spent most of his scholarly career trying to describe what Sumerian cosmological thinking actually was as a serious and coherent attempt to understand the structure of existence, one that happened to use divine characters as its vocabulary. He came to believe that the Sumerian creation tradition was less interested in the origin of matter than in the origin of order. The question was not where things came from, but how the cosmos came to be organised the way it was, with beings inhabiting particular roles, particular levels, particular relationships of obligation and authority. What this means for the creation sequence is that the question who came first was, for the Sumerian scribal tradition, inseparable from the question who has priority. And on that question, the texts are consistent enough to notice. The Anunnaki, the great gods, appear in every major Sumerian creation text not as themselves created beings, but as the presupposing condition of everything else. They are simply there when the cosmos begins to take shape. The Eridu Genesis opens with An, Enlil, Enki and Ninhursag already in existence and already in conversation about what they intend to make. The debate between sheep and grain opens with the Anunnaki seated on the holy mound before grain or sheep or any agricultural order exists. The Atrahasis epic opens with the Igigi, the younger generation of divine workers already labouring in a world that the great gods inhabit without effort. In none of these texts are the gods themselves created. They precede the creative act. They are not products of the cosmos, they are its authors. W.G. Lambert, whose 2013 compendium, Babylonian Creation Myths, remains the most comprehensive scholarly treatment of these texts, noted that this feature of the gods as presupposed rather than generated is one of the most consistent characteristics of Mesopotamian cosmogony. There are later Babylonian traditions, most prominently the Enuma Elish, in which divine beings are born from primordial waters, but even there, the primordial waters themselves, Apsu and Tiamat, are divine, so the question of ultimate origin simply moves back one step. What was here before the God who made things was another God, and what was here before that God was another God still, and eventually the text simply stops asking. When the Sumerian texts enumerate what was created, the divine beings are never on the list, because they are the ones doing the enumerating. The list begins after them, and what appears first on that list, across tradition after tradition, is not human. In the surviving portion of CBS 1673, the creation passage arrives already mid-sequence. The gods have fashioned the black-headed people, and also the animals, the four-footed beasts of the desert, the gazelles and the wild donkeys. The conjunction here in Jacobson's reading is not accidental. The animals are mentioned in the same breath as the humans, as though both belong to the same creative act. But the text that precedes this passage, the 2/3 now missing, apparently described an earlier state, a state in which neither animals nor humans yet existed, and the gods had not yet acted. Jacobson reconstructed this earlier state partly from the surviving lines, and partly from parallel passages in related texts. What those parallel texts describe is a cosmos that was full before humans arrived, full of divine beings, full of a divine order, full of an already established hierarchy of authority. The question the Sumerians were answering when they placed humans late in the sequence was not primarily a biological or evolutionary question. It was a question about where in a pre-existing order a new kind of being could be inserted, and the answer, consistently, was near the bottom, after much else had already been arranged. The question Lambert and Jacobson disagreed about quietly, in the footnotes and commentary of their respective editions, was whether this sequencing was descriptive or prescriptive. Was it telling you what happened in some cosmogonic past, or was it telling you what the proper order of things was, using narrative to make a philosophical claim? The distinction matters because if the sequence is descriptive, we are reading a history. If it is prescriptive, we are reading an argument. And if it is an argument, we have to ask, an argument for whose benefit? That question the texts themselves do not answer. What they do, instead, is begin with the same sequence again and again, from different directions, using different imagery, in different literary genres. 6 independent texts across 3 centuries, in 2 languages, that convergence is the argument. It is something closer to a conviction than an accident of one scribe's theology. Cattle before people, grain before bread, the word the debate between sheep and grain, uses for the human beings who exist before agricultural animals are sent down from the Holy Mound, is Usa Ig, the same term that appears in CBS Wene 673, the same term used throughout the Sumerian literary corpus to mean something close to the human race or the black-headed people. The problem is what the text says those people were doing and what it implies about their condition. Like sheep, they ate grass with their mouths and drank water from the ditches. This is the debate text's description of humanity before grain and sheep exist. It is precise, and it is strange. The Usai-Ig are present. They are alive, but they have no grain, no bread, no wool, no domesticated animals. They eat vegetation directly from the ground and drink unprocessed water. The text is using an animal simile to describe people, and the simile only works if the reader understands the distinction between the 2 states, what humans were before agricultural species existed and what they become after. This cuts against the grain of the Eridu Genesis tradition, and the tension is real enough to need accounting for. If humans exist before the Anunnaki send grain and sheep down from the Holy Mound, then in the debate tradition, humans precede the agricultural animals, which seems to contradict the Eridu Genesis, where animals and humans are created together, and the Atrahasis epic, where the world before human creation is already a complex divine economy. The Nippur scribes, who copied the debate text, apparently kept both traditions in their archive without marking any tension between them. The same tablet house that preserved the debate text also preserved parallel creation narratives that described animals alongside or before humanity. The Adubba the scribal school, literally house of tablets, operated on the principle that multiple versions of a tradition could coexist as copies without requiring reconciliation. The students who learned to write by copying these texts copied all of them. The contradiction, if it was perceived as a contradiction, left no mark in the textual record. Think of it this way. If I said someone ate like an animal before they learned to cook, I might mean they were uncivilized, not that they were biologically pre-human. The debate text may be doing exactly that, and the distinction matters for everything that follows. One reading of the debate text pre-agricultural humans proposed by scholars working on Sumerian literary genre is that the opening scene is not describing a different moment in time, but a different quality of existence. The Usai eating grass are not humans at an earlier point in history. They are humans without civilization, humans without the gifts the gods have not yet given them. Humans in a state that is technically human but functionally animal. The text is drawing a distinction not between 2 chronological eras, but between 2 modes of being, one dependent on divine provision and one not yet so. If this reading is correct, then the opening of the debate text is not placing humans before animals in the chronological sequence at all. It is saying, here is what humans look like without the created gifts that the Anunnaki will provide. Here is the condition from which grain and sheep rescue them. But another reading, equally defensible, treats the pre-agricultural humans of the debate text as genuinely prior, as a first creation that precedes the agricultural order. In this reading, the Anunnaki created human beings first, found them insufficient, unable to sustain a civilization, and then created the animals and plants that would make civilization possible. Humans come early in this tradition, but only as a first draft. The agricultural creation that follows them is what makes human existence meaningful. The two readings are not reconcilable on the surface, and the text does not choose between them. That refusal to choose is, as it turns out, consistent with how the entire tradition operates. What the debate text cannot tell us what its genre, a formal literary disputation between two personified forces, does not require it to say is which of these was understood to be literally true and which was a narrative convenience. The Anunnaki on the Holy Mound, creating grain and sheep and sending them down to earth, this is the setting for what is primarily an argument about which is more valuable, the gift of wool and meat or the gift of bread and beer. The creation sequence is the frame, not the subject, but frames reveal assumptions, and the assumption embedded in the debate text frame is that before grain and sheep, humans were not yet what they would become. Whatever the chronological order, in terms of kind, in terms of the quality and completeness of human existence, the agricultural animals and grains created after humans are what complete the picture. The sequence is not merely temporal, it is hierarchical in a different sense. What comes later may not be later in time, but later in the order of importance, arriving to complete something that was already there but unfinished. Whether the Sumerians intended this reading or not, it is the reading the text most naturally supports, and it creates a question planted here with no expectation of an immediate answer about what it means for a species to be created before the things it needs to be itself. The Holy Mound and what came down from it, the opening lines of the debate text, place the Anunnaki in a specific location. The Duranki, the Holy Mound, the bond between heaven and earth. This is Nippur's cosmological signature. Nippur was understood by the Sumerian scribal tradition to be the navel of the world, the place where divine authority descended into the material realm. The texts copied in Nippur's Iduba tended to reflect Nippur's theological geography, and the Holy Mound appears throughout the Nippur literary corpus as the site of divine deliberation. When the Anunnaki on the Holy Mound created grain and sheep and sent them down, they were performing an act that the text describes explicitly as motivated by their own need. The Anunnaki ate. They required sustenance. They gathered in the divine banqueting chamber, the text calls it by name, and partook of what sheep and grain provided, but the text says they were not sated. The creation of agricultural species was not, in this text, primarily an act of provision for humans. It was an act of provision for gods who were hungry and not satisfied. Humans, in this reading, are the beneficiaries of a creation event aimed at someone else. The same logic appears in a different kind of text, entirely not a debate or a disputation, but something closer to a divine administrative survey. In Enki and the World Order, Enki proceeds through the organisation of the natural world, assigning authority over rivers, marshes, sea, rain, agriculture, animals distributing each domain to its appropriate divine overseer. Humans appear in this organisational scheme, but they appear as one component of a larger created system rather than as its purpose. The rivers were not organised for humans. The marshes were not assigned for humans. The system is organised for the gods who manage it and humans happen to inhabit one portion of it. Read alongside the organisational texts, the debate tradition stops looking like theology and starts looking like economics. The Anunnaki did not create the agricultural and animal world in order to sustain human civilization. They created it to sustain themselves. Human civilization was, in a sense, an incidental beneficiary, or, in the harder reading, a piece of the infrastructure the gods required. The scribal students who copied the debate text were themselves embedded in an administrative and religious system that mirrored this structure in miniature. The Adaba trained scribes not as independent scholars, but as servants of the temple economy, the institutions that managed agricultural production, animal husbandry, and labour allocation on behalf of the gods and their representatives. The cosmological hierarchy described in the creation text was, for the scribal apprentice, not abstract theology. It was a description of the world he actually inhabited, a world in which the divine economy came first and human labour served it. That the debate texts were standard curriculum copied and recopied as scribal exercises means that the creation sequence embedded in their opening lines was something every trained scribe had physically written out with their own hands. The wedge-shaped impressions in the clay, the morning lesson, the master's correction. The opening of the debate text was not philosophy encountered in adulthood. It was one of the first things a scribal student copied. The hierarchy of creation gods above, agricultural order below, humans beneath that order serving it, was practiced into the hand before it was reasoned by the mind. What the debate text cannot resolve what it generates by its end, rather than answers, is whether the Anunnaki's creation of cattle and grain, specifically to satisfy divine hunger, was the template for all subsequent creation. The labour motivation appears here, quietly, as a subtext. It will appear much louder in the tradition that comes next. Before humans were made, the gods were exhausted. The first line of the Atrahasis epic is also its ancient title. Babylonian scribes, when they referred to a text by its first line, a common cataloguing practice, called this one by the words that open it, Enuma Ilu Awilum. When Lambert and Millard prepared their 1969 edition for Oxford's Clarendon Press, working primarily from the tablet designated BM 78941 in the British Museum, they translated those opening words as "when the gods like man." The syntax was disputed almost immediately. Lambert himself revised his reading in later work, but the meaning of the opening section is not in dispute. The world the Atrahasis epic describes in its first tablet is a world without humans, in which the Igigi, the younger gods, are performing physical labour, digging riverbeds, cutting canals, moving earth. They have been doing this for a very long time. The text specifies 3,600 years of labour. The number is not meant literally, it is the Mesopotamian way of signalling that an almost incomprehensible duration has passed. By the time the epic opens, the Igigi have been working so long that their complaint is not merely about exhaustion, it is about the impossibility of continuing. They call a strike, they burn their tools, they march on the house of Enlil. The Anunnaki, the great gods, are woken in the night. Enlil is told that the Igigi are at his gate. The assembly convenes. And the resolution, the decision that changes the structure of the cosmos, is that a new being will be created to take over the labour. The Igigi's burden will be transferred, someone else will dig the canals. The creation of humanity in the Atrahasis epic is not a gift, it is a labour solution. This is the most direct statement in all of Mesopotamian literature of what human beings are. From a divine administrative standpoint, a substitute workforce created to resolve a divine labour crisis in a world that was already fully organised, already populated with divine beings, already just running on a labour supply that had finally, after millennia, refused to continue, by the time Wi'ila, one of the Allah gods. A minor divine being singled out for his intellect or his transgression, the text is not entirely clear, is killed, and his flesh and blood mixed with clay. The world into which humans are born is not a blank slate. It has rivers dug by divine labour. It has canals cut by divine hands. It has an administrative structure managed by divine authority. The humans who emerge from Nintu's womb are not the first inhabitants of this world. They are the latest, and they are created specifically to fit into a role that was already vacated by beings who had filled it for 3,600 years before walking off the job. BM 78941, the primary Old Babylonian tablet for the epic, is dated to approximately 1635 BCE, making it roughly contemporary with CBS 1673 in Philadelphia. The two tablets were likely produced within a generation of each other in different cities Sippar and Nippur by scribes working within the same literary tradition. Their physical similarity is remarkable: baked clay, cuneiform script, palm-sized or slightly larger. Their content tells the same basic story from different angles. What BM 78941 supplies that CBS 10673 cannot, because the relevant section of CBS 10673 is missing, is the reason for human creation. The Eridu Genesis, even if its creation section were fully preserved, might not have explained why the black-headed people and the animals were fashioned. The Atrahasis epic states the reason with unusual directness, because the gods who had been performing that function could not continue. The world needed workers. The human species was the solution. This means that before humans, in the Atrahasis tradition, the world contained not just the divine administration, the Anunnaki, sitting in their assembly, deciding fates, but an entire labour economy run by divine workers. The Igigi who dug the canals were not doing symbolic work. The rivers and irrigation systems they built were real features of the Mesopotamian landscape, maintained and extended across generations of historical memory. The epic is saying that those features were built before human beings existed, by beings who are not human, who eventually decided they had had enough. The name of the god whose death made human life possible is given: Wi'ila, one name. The text does not tell us whether the other gods mourned him or whether his killing was understood as a sacrifice or an execution. It tells us his name, and his blood, mixed with clay, became part of what humans are. The divine substance that entered the human body at the moment of creation was not bestowed as a gift, it was extracted. But the Atrahasis tradition raises a question it does not answer. What happens when the labour solution itself produces beings that fall outside the labour hierarchy? That question belongs to a different text and a different kind of failure. The contest and its failures the Enki and Nippur myth opens, like the Atrahasis epic, with divine beings at work before humans exist. The minor gods are labouring, they are complaining. Their mother Nama, identified in this tradition as the primordial sea, the mother of the gods themselves, hears the complaint and goes to her son Enki, who is asleep in the deep waters. Sleeping with the particular heaviness of someone who has not yet been asked to solve an urgent problem. Nama's message to Enki, as rendered in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian Literature Oxford's digital catalogue of surviving Sumerian texts, is direct. Rise from your bed, use your wisdom, fashion a deputy who will take over the god's toil. Enki does not immediately create a human. First, he devises the method clay from the deep, animated by the divine mothers, shaped by Ninma's hands. The creation happens in stages, and the text watches each stage carefully. What the text watches most carefully is not the successful creation, but the failed ones. After the banquet that follows the first successful human creation, a banquet at which Enki and Ninma drink beer together, which the text seems to consider, significant Ninma proposes a contest. She will shape beings from clay, and Enki must find a fate for each one. He accepts, and Ninma creates, one by one, 6 human beings whose bodies are not what the standard requires. A person who cannot hold their hands straight, a person who cannot see, a person who cannot move their feet, a person who is incontinent, a woman who cannot give birth, a person who has neither male nor female characteristics in the conventional sense. For each one, Enki finds a social role. The person whose hands will not straighten becomes a silversmith, because the craft requires dexterity of a different kind. The person who cannot see becomes a singer or a musician, because sight is not what music requires. The person who cannot walk becomes a craftsman. For each of Ninma's 6 creations, human beings who deviate from what the text elsewhere describes as standard human form Enki devises a destiny, a place in the social world where that form of existence has value. The creation sequence in the Enki and Ninma myth is therefore not just about when humans appear in the cosmic order. It is about what humans are that human existence admits of significant variation, that the cosmos, properly organised by Enki's wisdom, can accommodate that variation by assigning it function and meaning. The 6 unusual humans are not failures discarded, they are given a fate. Then it is Enki's turn. He shapes a being from clay, and the text calls this being Umul, which scholars have translated variously as "my day is far off" or "my day has been made remote." The being Enki creates is described as having a sick head, a sick heart, sick eyes, sick hands, not disabled in the ways Ninma's creations were disabled, but defective in a way that is fundamental. Ninma lifts Umul and tries to speak its fate. She cannot. The being that Enki has made is beyond her capacity to assign a destiny. The contest ends there, without a clean resolution, with Ninma holding something she cannot name. What does it mean, in Sumerian cosmological logic, for a created being to have no assignable fate? The Nam fate, destiny, the divine decree, was not merely a plan imposed on a being from outside. In Sumerian theology, as Jacobson argued throughout his work on Mesopotamian religion, the Nam was closer to a being's essential character as determined and recognised by divine authority. To have a fate decreed was to have your nature recognised and validated by the divine order. To be held by a god who cannot speak what you are, to fall outside the ordained structure entirely, is to be, in the deepest sense, beyond the edge of the cosmos as it was designed. This is not a minor detail. In a tradition where the creation of human beings is fundamentally about assigning them a role in the divine economy, a fate, a function, a place in the labour hierarchy, a created being that cannot be given, that assignment represents something the cosmological system cannot accommodate. Ninma's 6 creations are inside that system, if unusually situated. Umul is not. and the text does not resolve what happens to it. The being with no fate sits at the edge of the narrative, not discarded, but not placed. The question of what to do with a created species that has no natural place in the ordained order is a question the Enki and Ninmah myth raises and deliberately leaves open. It will resurface in a different form in everything that follows. The bilingual problem the Nippur tradition is not the only one asking these questions. A different city, a different language, a different century, and the same sequence, preserved in a form that adds one specific detail Nippur does not provide. In the Middle Assyrian period, roughly 1400 to 1000 B scribes in the city of Ashur copied a text that scholars now catalogue as Car 4, preserved in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin under the CDL reference P282595. The text is bilingual, Sumerian on one side of the tablet, Akkadian on the other, the two languages running in parallel columns, each translating the other, each carrying slightly different emphases in the places where the two literary traditions diverged. The text belongs to the creation tradition, but occupies an unusual position within it. It does not begin, like the Atrahasis epic, with the primordial labour of the Igigi. It does not begin, like the debate texts, with the Anunnaki on the Holy Mound. It begins after the basic features of the world are already established: rivers, canals, the infrastructure of civilization, and asks, from within that established world, a bureaucratic question: what should be created now? The answer is humans. But the mechanism of their creation differs in a specific way from the Atrahasis tradition. In Atrahasis, a single named god, We-Ilah, is killed and his blood mixed with clay. In Car 4, the beings who die to create humanity are called the Allah gods, a group, unnamed as individuals, killed collectively. Their blood is mixed with clay, Nintu forms the bodies. But no Allah god is ever named. The group is defined by its function divine beings of sufficient standing to provide the sacred element, but the individuals within it are not identified. W.G. Lambert, whose 2013 compendium addressed Car 4 at length, noted that the anonymity of the allegods is a persistent feature of this tradition, and one that scholarship has not adequately explained. The Atrahasis epic's We-Ilah is named precisely because names matter. In Mesopotamian literature, the text is doing something specific by making the divine death individual unnameable. The Car 4 tradition's collective anonymity may reflect a different theological emphasis, not the sacrifice of an individual for a specific purpose, but the contribution of a divine category, a class of beings whose collective substance becomes the human inheritance. What is consistent between the two traditions, the named We-Ilah and the unnamed Allah gods, is the basic mechanism. Something divine had to end for something human to begin. The human body, in both traditions, contains an ingredient that was once a god. The clay alone was insufficient. The divine substance, the Temu, the consciousness or personality, the element that in Mesopotamian thought made a being capable of thought and deliberate action, required a divine source. This means that in the Mesopotamian creation sequence, humans are not merely the last created species. They are the species created partly from an earlier one. The hierarchy of creation doubles back on itself. The gods come first, then the divine labour workforce, and when the labour workforce is found insufficient or its divine members no longer willing, humans are made partly from what the gods provide in terms of clay and process, and partly from what a divine being, gives up in death. The sequence is not simply additive. It is a sequence in which one kind of being is consumed to produce the next. The Ashur archive that preserved Ka 4 was not Nippur. The city of Ashur, modern Kalat Shirkat, was the ancient capital of Assyria, a different scribal tradition, a different theological emphasis, a different set of institutional priorities. The tradition moved with its scribes copied into Akkadian, pressed into bilingual tablets, carried from Nippur north to Ashur without losing its essential claim. What the world was made of, and in what order, was considered too important to leave in one city's keeping. Monsters Before Men on the night of December 3rd, 1872, a man named George Smith stood before a meeting of the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London and announced that he had found, among the cuneiform tablets brought from Nineveh to the British Museum, a Babylonian account of a great flood. The room, according to contemporary reports, was so affected by the announcement that Smith himself was moved to remove his clothing in a moment of professional excitement that became one of the more eccentric footnotes in the history of Assyriology. The tablets he was describing were from the library of Ashurbanipal, the 7th century Assyrian king who had assembled in Nineveh what was, by contemporary standards, the most systematic collection of written knowledge in the world. Among those tablets were the 7 that comprised the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, whose title comes from its opening words, Enuma Elish, Lanabu Shamamu, when on high the heavens had not been named. The tablet catalogued as K5419C, housed in the British Museum, preserves part of tablet first of the 7. It is one of many fragments. The complete Enuma Elish is reconstructed from dozens of partial copies found across Nineveh and elsewhere. The Enuma Elish differs from the Sumerian creation texts. In significant ways it was composed in Akkadian rather than Sumerian. It reflects Babylonian rather than Nippur theology. Its protagonist is Marduk rather than Enki or Enlil, and its overall structure is as much a political document establishing Marduk's supremacy among the gods as it is a creation account. But for the question of what existed before humans, it is the most explicit of all the traditions. Before humans, the Enuma Elish tells us there were 11 named creatures. Tiamat, the primordial saltwater, personified as a divine being of enormous power, creates them in response to the young god's noise and the threat they represent. She gave birth to creatures that the text enumerates with some precision: the serpent, the dragon, the Lamu, a hairy hero, Figure the great lion, the mad dog, the scorpion man, the raging storms, the fish man, and the bull man, among others. 11 in total, each given venom instead of blood, each bearing Malamu, the divine radiance or terror, instead of ordinary divine attributes. These 11 are not minor figures. They are created with the deliberate intent that they be terrifying, that they function as an army, as a counterforce to the young gods who have disturbed the primordial waters. They are fully created beings, given names, given functions, given leadership under Kingu, whom Tiamat elevates and provides with the tablet of destiny. In the cosmological logic of the Enuma Elish, these 11 creatures are as real and as intentionally made as anything else in the creation sequence. They are not accidents, they are not errors, they are the deliberate products of Tiamat's creative power. Marduk defeats Tiamat, of course the epic's central action. The 11 creatures are captured and bound, all except Kingu, their leader, whom Marduk kills. From Kingu's blood, mixed with clay, the first humans will be made. And Marduk, in a detail that connects the text to Mesopotamian material culture, makes statues of the 11 and places them at the gate of the Esagila, his great temple in Babylon. The 11 primordial monsters created before humans exist become, in the aftermath of their defeat, architectural guardians. They stand at the threshold. If you have stood in the Assyrian galleries at the British Museum and felt the particular stillness, those rooms produce the sense of something watching from a great distance. Part of what you are feeling may be exactly this: the presence of forms that the tradition understood as older than human, stationed at the boundary because that is where the tradition said they belonged. Human beings are created after all of this in Tablet 6 from the blood of the defeated Kingu. By the time humans are made, the cosmos has already seen primordial divine waters, the birth of the first gods from those waters, the young god's noise and the conflict it provokes, the creation of 11 named monstrous species, a cosmic war, a defeat, an ordering of the heavens and earth from Tiamat's body, and the construction of Marduk's temple. Humans arrive at the very end of a cosmos that is already thoroughly populated, organised, and architecturally furnished. The question the Enuma Elish raises, and which it raises differently from the Sumerian texts, is what the 11 pre-human creatures are in the cosmological order after their defeat. The Sumerian traditions created humans to replace the labour of divine workers. The Enuma Elish creates humans to replace the labour of the defeated gods, who must now serve Marduk. But the 11 monsters become statues. They are preserved in the material world at the gate of the temple, no longer active but not annihilated. Across Mesopotamian palace architecture, throughout the first millennium BC, at Nimrud, at Khorsabad, at Nineveh itself, the doorways and processional ways were guarded by massive hybrid figures, the Lamassu, winged bulls with human heads, the Mushusu, the serpent dragon of Babylon, rendered in glazed brick on the Ishtar Gate, and now partially reconstructed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. These were not decorative choices in any modern sense. They were apotropaic protective, warding, occupying a specific cosmological function at the threshold between the ordered interior and the less ordered exterior. The forms that guarded the door were not human. They were older than human, and the culture that placed them there apparently felt that this was the appropriate arrangement. The guardian animals, the Lamassu, at the British Museum weigh approximately 30 tons each. They were quarried, carved and transported from the palaces of Nimrud, ancient Kalhu, in the 19th century by Austin Henry Layard, whose excavations in the 1840s and 1850s brought to London objects so massive that their removal required engineering solutions that had not previously been contemplated in the context of archaeology. They stand now in the Assyrian galleries, 2 winged bulls with human heads, each with 5 legs, 4 visible in profile, 4 visible from the front. A 5th added so that the figure reads correctly from both angles, their faces calm and slightly remote, their beards elaborately curled, their eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the visitor's head. They were created in their original context to guard the threshold of the palace of Ashurnasirpal II at Nimrud, dating from the 9th century BC. But the tradition they represent hybrid beings at the entrance, part animal, part divine, belonging to a category of existence that precedes and encompasses ordinary human life, reaches back considerably further than the 9th century into the same textual traditions that produced the Enuma Elish's 11 monsters and the debate text's agricultural animals sent down from the Holy Mound. The tablet in Philadelphia has nothing to say about Lamassu or Mushusu Those are Assyrian and Babylonian forms, later and northern. But the logic they embody, that the forms preceding human existence stand at the thresholds of human space, reaches back to exactly the tradition CBS 10673 belongs to. The break at the top of that tablet covers whatever the scribe wrote about what came first. Down here, in the surviving lower third, the animals are already present. The threshold has already been crossed. Whether this represents a continuous theological tradition or a series of independent decisions that happen to produce similar results, scholarship cannot determine with confidence. Ira Spar, in the Metropolitan Museum's essay on Mesopotamian creation myths, has noted the convergences without asserting the direct genealogy. The evidence is suggestive in precisely the way that archaeological evidence often is. It points in a direction without providing the destination. What it adds to the creation sequence assembled from tablets in 4 countries, in 2 ancient languages, across a span of several centuries, is a material dimension. The pre-human species of the Mesopotamian creation tradition were not only textual, they were rendered in stone and brick and placed at the entrances to the most important buildings in the ancient world. Whatever their precise relationship to the literary tradition, the hybrid guardians at the threshold represent a persistent Mesopotamian intuition that the forms which precede human civilization are also the forms that define its boundaries. Before humans, there were other kinds of beings. After humans arrived, those earlier beings became the guardians of the spaces humans inhabited. For now, the 30-ton ball at the British Museum keeps its own council. Dillman before the Raven called Thorkild Jacobson described Dillman, in his 1976 Treasures of Darkness, as a mythological space that operates outside the normal categories of Sumerian cosmological time, not a place that preceded the ordered world in a chronological sense, but a place that exists in a kind of eternal earliness, a condition before conditions were established. There is no tablet for Dillman in the Penn Museum case. The myth was copied and preserved at Nippur, but its theological geography belongs to somewhere else, entirely a place that exists, in Sumerian cosmological thinking, outside the ordinary coordinates of time and location, which is its own instruction about how to read it. The Enki and Ninhursag myth, which is set in Dillman, opens with a description of that space that reads, even in scholarly translation, as something close to genuine strangeness. In Dillman, the raven was not yet cawing, the partridge not cackling, the lion did not slay, the wolf was not carrying off lambs, the dog had not been taught to make the kid curl up, the pig had not learned that grain was to be eaten. This is not a world without animals. The raven exists, the partridge exists, the lion, the wolf, the dog, the pig, they are all mentioned, but they are not yet themselves. The raven's cawing is the raven's identity. Without the caw, the raven is present, but not real in the full sense. The lion does not slay, which means the lion has not yet become what a lion is. The animals exist in Dillman in a state of pre-behaviour form without function, species without the specific nature that makes them what they are. Human beings are not mentioned in the Dillman opening, they are the absent variable. And what the text proceeds to describe the creation of plants through the union of Enki and Ninhursag, the eating of those plants, the illness that results, and the creation of 8 healing deities by Ninhursag to cure Enki's 8 wounds, has nothing to do with the creation of humans at all. Humans are simply outside the frame of this myth. The Dillman tradition is a creation narrative in which human beings are not the subject and not the goal. This is unusual enough to notice. Most of the creation texts examined here include humans as the eventual product of the divine creative process, even if that process involves many prior steps. The Dilmun myth creates plants. It creates healing gods. It establishes the conditions under which the natural world can function. And then it ends without creating humans. The Nippur scribal archive preserved the Dilmun myth alongside the debate texts, alongside the Eridu Genesis, alongside the hymns and lamentations and administrative records that constitute the corpus. The scribes apparently saw no need to harmonise the Dilmun tradition with the traditions that do create humans. The absence of humans from the Dilmun myth was either not noticed or not considered a problem requiring solution. One reading of this, and it is speculative, the kind of interpretation that the evidence permits but does not demand, is that the Dilmun myth represents a stratum of Sumerian cosmological thinking that predates the labour creation framework. In the labour creation texts, Atrahasis, Enki and Ninmah carve for humans are created to solve a specific divine problem, the problem of work that needs doing and a divine workforce that can no longer wishes to do it. In the Dilmun tradition, there is no such problem. The creative process is about fertility, about the relationship between water and the productive earth, about plants and healing and the conditions of organic life. Humans, in this older stratum, may not have been the relevant category, may not have been the lens through which the creation of the world needed to be understood. If that reading has any validity, it suggests that the human-centered creation narrative, the idea that humans were created by the Anunnaki for a specific purpose, arrived at the center of Sumerian cosmological thinking at a particular historical moment, not as the eternal background, but as a development, a reframing. And before that, reframing. There was a tradition in which the world was created not for humans, and not even with humans in mind, but through divine processes that produced plants and animals and healing and the conditions of organic life, and humans was simply one of many things the world eventually contained. The scribes who preserved both the Dilmun tradition and the labour creation tradition were not choosing between them. They were preserving everything, and in preserving everything, they left us the picture in all its productive inconsistency, a picture in which the question of where humans fit in the created order has more than one answer, depending on which text you read and which tradition you inherit. The labour problem, the opening line of the Atrahasis epic, is the one that stays with you after you have read everything else. The world before humans is a world of divine labour canals dug by Igigi hands, riverbeds cleared by divine effort, the infrastructure of civilization built and maintained by beings who are not human, but who are, in this text, performing human work. The line that names this condition is the ancient title of the epic itself, and it is a line that inverts every assumption about the relationship between gods and work. In much of the theology the ancient Near East produced, and in many of the traditions that inherited from it, the divine is defined partly by its exemption from labour. Gods receive sacrifice, humans perform it. Gods receive tribute, humans provide it. The exemption of the divine from physical work is so fundamental to the category God in this tradition that a text which opens by describing gods doing physical work is making a statement that is theologically startling. The Atrahasis epic makes that statement on its first line, and then spends 3 tablets working out its implications. The Igigi are divine, but they labour. Their labour is the condition from which the cosmos needs rescue, and the rescue, the creation of humans, is specifically the creation of a being whose nature will not exempt it from work. Humans are defined, in this tradition, by their labour obligation. It is not an accident of their situation, it is the reason for their creation. What this means for the creation sequence is that the hierarchy of created beings in the Atrahasis tradition is not merely temporal, it is structural. The Anunnaki are at the top, they do not work, they decide. The Igigi are in the middle, they work, but they are divine and eventually refuse. Humans are at the bottom, they work, and they are not divine. And the text does not imagine them refusing in any permanent or successful way. The sequence from Anunnaki to Igigi to human is a sequence of decreasing authority and increasing labour obligation, each level of the hierarchy defined by what it owes to the level above it. The Nippur scribal students who copied this text were themselves embedded in a hierarchical labour system that reflected the cosmological hierarchy with uncomfortable precision. The Aduba trained scribes for the temple economy, an economy managed by the great temples of Nippur on behalf of the gods those temples housed. The scribal students labour the physical act of pressing a stylus into clay, copying text after text, practicing the signs until the hand could reproduce them without hesitation, was labour in service of a system that was itself understood to be in service of the divine order. The student was not the bottom of the hierarchy, there were farmers below and labourers below them, but the student was not far from the bottom. And the texts he copied described the entire system as divinely ordained, cosmologically necessary, in place since before the first human hand pressed the first wedge into the first clay. The administrative records from Nippur, the lists of grain rations, the labour allocation tablets, the records of workers assigned to canal maintenance and field preparation mirror the cosmological claims of the creation texts with a specificity that is either striking coincidence or evidence of a genuine relationship between cosmological ideology and administrative practice. Samuel Noah Kramer, who devoted most of his scholarly career from the 1930s through the 1980s to Sumerian literature, argued repeatedly that the Sumerian scribal tradition was not merely describing the world, but legitimizing a particular arrangement of it. The creation texts on this reading are not just cosmology, they are a justification of the existing social order. Extended back to the moment of creation, whether Kramer was right about the ideological function of the creation sequence is a question that scholarship has not settled. What is not in dispute is the structural parallel. The hierarchy of created beings in the texts maps onto the hierarchy of social organisation in the administrative records with a consistency that is either meaningful or very convenient. Humans come last in the creation sequence, and they occupy the labour positions at the base of the social pyramid. The gods come first, and their representatives, the temples, the priests, the royal administrators, occupy the positions of authority at the top. The creation sequence is not just answering a question about the past, it may be making a claim about the present. And the claim it is making that the ordering of the cosmos has always been this way. That it was established before humans existed and simply extended to include them when they were finally created is one that the scribal tradition transmitted with great care and great consistency, copying it into the hands of every student who passed through the tablet house. What that tradition could not transmit, because the question was perhaps too close to ask, was how the humans who copied these texts understood their own position in the cosmological hierarchy they were so carefully preserving. The scribes who knew the Aduba at Nippur, the scribal school, the tablet house has been partially reconstructed from archaeology and from the remarkable collection of school texts that the Nippur excavations recovered in such abundance. We know something about its physical layout: a courtyard, benches of dried mud, tablet bins for storing in progress work, the smell that ancient buildings of this type seem to have shared across cultures: dust, dried clay, something faintly animal from the reed mats. We know something about its curriculum, because the exercise tablets themselves are evidence. Apprentices first copied simple sign lists, then moved to model contracts and administrative formulas, then to literary texts that were considered standard: the debates, the hymns, the creation narratives, the proverbs. One of those standard literary texts was the debate between sheep and grain. The exercise tablets that preserve it in multiple nearly identical copies are identified as school copies by features that distinguish them from temple or administrative copies. They were made more quickly, the signs are slightly less precise, and in some cases the master's correction appears in the margin, a firmer hand going over an uncertain wedge. A student learning to write by copying the opening of the debate text was copying the lines that describe humanity before grain and sheep existed, like sheep they ate grass with their mouths and drank water from the ditches. The student was pressing those words into clay with a reed stylus, in a school, in a city, in a civilization built on grain agriculture and domesticated animals. The words described a condition from which his entire world had been rescued, or so the text implied. They described a time before the Anunnaki sent down from the Holy Mound the gifts that made human civilization possible. The student was not that earlier human, but the text said that he was the descendant of that earlier human, that the species to which the scribal student belonged had once eaten grass and drunk ditch water, and had been given grain and sheep because the Anunnaki decided to provide them. The Song of the Hoe, another pedagogical staple of the Nippur curriculum, adds one more element to the creation sequence. In this text, Enlil creates the hoe first, not as an afterthought, not as a tool provided to already existing humans, but as a creative act that precedes and enables human creation. Enlil plants the hoe in the earth, which then opens up, and from the opening come human beings. He had the black-headed people break through the earth like a plant. The hoe is the instrument of human creation. Before humans, the hoe exists. The tool precedes the being who will use it. This is the final version of the sequence. Compressed into a single image, the divine instrument precedes the human. The created order that will sustain human existence, agricultural tools, animals, grain, is in place before the humans who will depend on it are released from the earth. The sequence is not accidental or gradual, it is designed. The cosmos was prepared for human beings before human beings were put into it, and the preparation required a great deal of time and work, most of it performed by beings who are not human. The hierarchy of creation gods above, agricultural order below, humans beneath that order serving it, was practiced into the hand before it was reasoned by the mind. The scribal apprentice who copied the Song of the Hoe copied a text that said his own species had been broken from the earth like a plant by a divine hoe into a world that had already been furnished for him. He wrote this with his own hand. He pressed the wedges into the clay, he corrected his mistakes when the master indicated them, and then he set the tablet in the bin with the others and waited for the next assignment. Did he know that the text was describing him? Not him specifically, not the individual student with his tired hands and his afternoon lesson, but the category to which he belonged. The species whose late arrival in the cosmological sequence was recorded in text after text in the same archive where he worked. The record does not preserve his thoughts. What it preserves is the text copied faithfully, the wedges pressed firmly or tentatively depending on the day and the hour, and the question sitting in the middle of the curriculum without anyone in the tradition needing to acknowledge that it was there. 3 readings of a single sequence assembled from tablets in 4 countries, in 2 ancient languages, across a span of several centuries. The picture that the creation texts produce is partial but coherent enough to name. The Anunnaki, the great gods, precede everything. The divine labour workforce, the Igigi, populates the world before humans and works it for an incomprehensible duration. The natural world animals, agricultural species, plants, the conditions of organic life is created or organised before humans take their place in it. The 11 hybrid creatures of the Enuma Elish are created, fight a war, and are bound before the first human is fashioned from clay and divine blood, and humans arrive in every tradition, specifically because something that came before them has reached a limit or a crisis or a failure that only a new kind of being can resolve. 3 ways of reading this sequence have been articulated by scholars working in different areas of the field, and they are worth naming carefully because they are not fully compatible with each other, and none of them can be eliminated by the evidence as it currently exists. The first reading is purely mythological in the technical sense. The sequence describes not events in cosmological history, but relationships of dependency and authority in the present. The Anunnaki come first in the myth, not because divine beings actually preceded the physical world in some temporal sense, but because divine authority is understood to precede and underlie everything else. Animals and agricultural species precede humans in the sequence, not because the world was literally populated before humans existed, but because human existence is understood to depend on those things. Grain comes before bread because bread is made from grain, and the myth encodes logical priority as temporal sequence. In this reading, the creation narratives are not history and were not understood as history. They are philosophical arguments presented in narrative form. The second reading, developed in different ways by Jacobson and by Kramer, treats the creation sequences as encoded wisdom, not literal history, but not merely symbolic either. The texts preserve real knowledge about the structure of existence, that human life is embedded in a larger order it did not create and cannot control, that the divine and natural systems on which human civilization depends are prior to and more fundamental than human civilization itself, and that acknowledging this priority is not humiliating but orienting. On this reading, the sequence places humans late, not to demean them, but to locate them correctly inside a cosmos that has its own structure and its own logic, which humans inherit but did not originate. The third reading, more historical in character, proposes that the creation sequences contain compressed memory of actual historical processes, the long periods during which human communities in Mesopotamia were organised around the management of animal herds and agricultural systems before the emergence of the complex urban civilization that the texts were produced to serve. The earlier cosmological traditions, like the Dilmun myth, that preceded the labour creation framework and show a world being organised without humans at its centre, the gradual development of a theological understanding that placed human labour at the base of a divinely ordained hierarchy as a way of legitimising that hierarchy's demands on the human beings subject to it. Tikva Frymer-Kensky, in her 1977 analysis of the Atrahasis epic's significance for understanding early creation mythology, noted that the labour motivation for human creation appears so consistently and so specifically across the Mesopotamian tradition that it is unlikely to be a late theological addition. It seems to be very old, perhaps older than the specific narrative forms that carry it. If she is right, then the sequence that places humans last, specifically as a labour solution, is not a later development, but a foundation. The tradition did not begin with humans at the centre and then push them to the margins. It may have always understood them to be on the margins from the very beginning of the scribal tradition that recorded it. Each of these three readings is defensible. Each is partially supported by the evidence. That is where the evidence runs out, and it is worth staying there rather than forcing a resolution the sources do not support. Or it may be that the ambiguity is the most accurate description of what the Sumerians were doing. A tradition that maintained the Dilmun myth alongside the Atrahasis epic, the debate text alongside the Eridu Genesis, the Song of the Hoe alongside the Enki and Ninmah, contest a tradition that preserved, copied and transmitted multiple incompatible accounts of the same sequence, without apparently feeling the need to reconcile them, may have been deliberately maintaining a productive ambiguity. The question of what came before humans, and why, may have been understood not as a question with a single correct answer, but as a question worth keeping open, because the openness was instructive. What precisely it was instructing is the question that the surviving evidence leaves unanswered, and what that unanswered quality preserves even now in the Penn Museum case in the British Museum galleries. In the Berlin collection may be exactly what the scribes intended to preserve. What the order preserved, the three readings of the creation sequence are not quite as incompatible as they first appear. They are, in a sense, reading the same feature of the texts from different distances. The pure mythological reading sees the sequence as logical structure translated into temporal narrative. The encoded wisdom reading sees it as an honest orientation, a description of the real relationship between human existence and the larger systems on which it depends. The historical memory reading sees it as a record of how a particular civilization came to understand its own position in a world it inherited rather than created. What all three agree on, without quite saying so, is this: the creation sequence is not primarily about the past, it is about the present. It is an account of why things are the way they are, why humans work, why divine authority has the shape it has, why the natural world is organised as it is, why the canal exists and who should maintain it. The sequence is cosmological justification, and it works by locating the present order in a past so deep that questioning the present order would require questioning the structure of creation itself. If this is what the sequence was doing, then the scribes who transmitted it across 1,000 years of copying were transmitting the organising principle of the world they inhabited the principle that said the divine came first, the natural order came second, and humans came after both, to serve both, because that was the order in which the cosmos had always been arranged. The question, the ambiguity, may have been designed to preserve the question no scribal student would ask aloud, and no master would need to answer, is whether that arrangement was chosen or inevitable. Whether the Anunnaki created humans because they had to, because the Igigi had rebelled and a labour solution was required, or whether they created humans because they wanted to, because the cosmos was incomplete without a being capable of deliberate directed work and the cultivation of a world, whether human beings are an emergency measure or a culminating intention. The texts, taken together, say both. They did not harmonise, they did not choose. And whatever that refusal meant to them, what it means to us is that we inherit the complexity rather than a verdict. They kept the Dilmun tradition, in which humans are not the point at all. They kept the Enki and Ninmah myth, in which some humans are created who cannot be given a fate, who fall outside the ordained order, the problem that tradition identified and deliberately left open. What the preservation of all these versions together may tell us is that the Sumerians understood the question of human origins as genuinely open as a question that mattered too much to answer falsely and was too complex to answer simply. The scribal tradition transmitted the complexity rather than collapsing it into a single definitive account. And in doing so, it preserved something more durable than any single answer, the practice of holding multiple accounts of the same reality simultaneously, without forcing a resolution that the evidence does not support. CBS 10673 is back in its case in Philadelphia. The upper portion is still missing. The lines that would have told us what sequence the scribe at Nippur in 1650 BC recorded for the creation what came before the black-headed people and the animals, what the gods fashioned first, in what order are still absent. The break is clean and old and not going to give back what it took. What remains is the portion we have, the animals multiplying everywhere, the four-footed beasts in the desert, the black-headed people already present, the cities about to be named and assigned their divine protectors, a world already arranged before the human story the tablet is about to tell. The sequence is embedded in that world's furniture, in the animals already there, the gods already distributing authority, the infrastructure already in place. The youngest thing in the cosmos, the tablet, sits in its case in the Middle East galleries, 13 centimetres of baked clay, pale as old sand, the break at the top where the first lines should be. Around it, the other objects of the gallery keep their own arrangements, other tablets, other seals, other fragments of a world that was once described in writing by people who found it important to write things down. What CBS 10E673 preserves in its lower third is not the beginning. It is the moment after the beginning, the world already populated, already organised. The humans and animals already present, the cities about to be founded. The beginning is the missing section, and the beginning is what the Sumerians, in text after text, agreed was populated before humans arrived: divine beings, divine labour, animals, agricultural gifts, monstrous creatures, hybrid guardians, the conditions of organic life assembled in Dilmun before the raven had learned its call. To have been the youngest thing in the cosmos, the species that arrived after the riverbeds were dug, after the grain was sent down from the Holy Mound, after the Anunnaki had convened their assembly and the Igigi had walked off their work, and a solution had been agreed, is a particular kind of inheritance. You arrive in a world that was not waiting for you, precisely, but that was ready for you. The tools exist before you reach for them. The canals run before you drink from them. The agricultural animals are there before you learn to herd them. The Sumerian scribes, who copied and recopied these creation accounts across centuries, pressing the same words into the same clay with the same kind of stylus in city after city, were themselves that inheritance made conscious. They were the species described as arriving late, copying the account of their own lateness, each generation transmitting to the next the record of what came before. There is something precise in that image. A student in the Eridu at Nippur, perhaps 15 years old, copying out the opening lines of the debate text in the morning light that came through the courtyard, opening the words describing humans eating grass and drinking ditch water before the Anunnaki intervened, and not. Probably thinking much about it. It was the lesson. It was what you copied before you moved on to the next tablet, the next set of signs, the next piece of the curriculum that would make you a scribe. He pressed the wedges into the clay. The master corrected the ones that weren't quite right. The tablet went into the bin. The sequence was transmitted. Whether the sequence was a history, a philosophy, or a legitimizing framework, whether it was describing what happened, teaching what to understand, or justifying what already was, is a question the student did not need to answer. The question was kept open by the tradition itself, preserved in the multiplicity of accounts, in the inconsistencies no one harmonized, in the Dilmun myth sitting beside the Atrahasis in the same archive. The oldest surviving Sumerian creation tradition does not say that humans were the point of creation. It says again and again, in texts separated by centuries and cities and languages, that the cosmos was already full when we arrived. Divinity came first. The natural world came first. The labour and the tools and the agricultural order came first. We came into something that was already in motion, already organised, already old. There is a kind of quiet in that thought if you let it settle. Not the quiet of insignificance. The Sumerians did not consider themselves insignificant, but the quiet of an accurate location, knowing where in the order you stand, knowing what came before and how long it was there and what it cost to make room for you. The tablet rests in Philadelphia. The upper section is gone. Somewhere in the southern Iraqi plain, in the layered tell of ancient Nippur, the clay that once carried those lines may still exist compacted, unreadable, 3,000 years returned to the ground, or it is gone entirely. Either way, we have what we have, the portion that survived the break, the portion that begins mid-sequence, after the beginning. It is enough to see the shape of what was here before us. It is enough to know that we were not first. The noise that was too much the Atrahasis epic does not end with the creation of humans. That is where it begins. The 3 tablets that follow the creation account describe what happened after humans were made, and what happened, in the tradition's telling, is that humans became a problem for the same gods who created them. The mechanism of the problem is one of the stranger details in all of Mesopotamian literature. It is not that the humans were disobedient. It is not that they were wicked or disrespectful or failing in their labour obligations. The problem is simpler and more uncomfortable than any of those. Humans were too loud. They multiplied. And as they multiplied, the noise they produced, the sound of human life, the din of a growing population going about its work, disturbed the sleep of Enlil. the chief god, the one whose authority over the earth was most directly expressed. The text is precise about this. The word the Akkadian uses for what humans produce is rigmu noise, clamour, the sound of many voices. And the word for what Enlil cannot do because of it is a word for sleep, for rest, for the cessation of divine attention. Enlil, the god who ordered the creation of humans to solve the Igigi's labour crisis, now finds that the solution to one problem has created another. The earth is populated, the canals are maintained, the work is being done, and the noise of the workforce that is doing the work is keeping the chief god awake. The first response is plague. Enlil sends disease specifically. He sends Namtar, the god of fate and illness, to reduce the human population. Atrahasis, the exceptionally wise human whose name gives the epic its title, is advised by Enki to redirect human prayer and sacrifice. Instead of offering to their personal gods, they should offer to Namtar alone. Namtar, being honoured, relents. The plague ends. The humans recover. They multiply again. The noise returns. The second response is famine. Adad, the god of rain and storms, is instructed to withhold rain. The fields dry. The animals die. The fish disappear from the rivers. The text describes the famine in physical terms, people eating their own children, the road to human flesh becoming a road that was travelled. The reduction is temporary. Enki intervenes again. Atrahasis is advised again. The famine ends. The humans recover. They multiply. The noise returns. What this cycle establishes: plague, recovery, famine, recovery, noise, renewed divine disturbance, is something the creation sequence itself did not contain. The recognition that the creation of humans introduced a dynamic into the cosmos that the gods had not fully anticipated. The Igigi's labour crisis was solved, but the solution generated its own instability. The beings created to perform a function were also, by virtue of being alive and multiplying, generating consequences that exceeded the function they were created for. The flood, in this tradition, is not punishment for sin. It is a third attempt at population control larger in scale than the plague or the famine, intended to be permanent. Enlil convenes the divine assembly and secures agreement that this time the reduction will be total. Enki, who has twice advised Atrahasis on how to survive the god's previous interventions, is bound by oath not to warn a human directly. He gets around this by warning the wall of Atrahasis' house, speaking to the reed wall, which happens to have Atrahasis on the other side. The boat is built, the animals are gathered, the flood comes. That Enki finds a way around the oath, that he warns the wall and not the man, that the distinction is made with full awareness of its technical character, is one of the details that makes the Atrahasis epic feel genuinely strange. The tradition is not presenting a straightforward story of divine authority and human obedience. It is presenting a story in which the gods are in genuine disagreement about what to do with the beings they created, and in which one god goes to considerable trouble to undermine another god's solution without technically violating the terms of his own agreement. The question this raises for the creation sequence, a question the text itself does not answer, but which the narrative cannot avoid raising, is what it says about the gods' intentions that their creation immediately became a management problem. If humans were made to perform labour, and they are performing labour, but their existence as living multiplying beings creates consequences the gods find intolerable, then the creation contained a design flaw, or the design was not complete, or the gods who decided to create humans did not think through all of what creation means, that a being capable of labour is also a being capable of noise, of multiplication, of the accidental disturbance of divine rest. The scribal tradition that preserved the Atrahasis epic alongside the shorter creation-focused texts did not draw this conclusion explicitly, but the structure of the three-tablet narrative draws it structurally. Create, then manage the creation, then attempt to destroy it and start again. The sequence, from creation to flood, is not a fall from grace, but an engineering problem encountering its own unforeseen consequences, scaled to a cosmic level. What kingship was before it descended in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, in a case not far from the Weld-Blundell Prism, stands an object that presents the human story from the other end, not from the beginning of creation, but from the beginning of organised human authority, which the Sumerian tradition understood to be a moment that was itself preceded by a very long cosmic preparation. The Weld-Blundell Prism, acquired from a dealer in 1922, currently catalogued as AN 1T23.444, dated by its script to approximately 1800 BC, is a four-sided clay column approximately 20 centimetres tall, inscribed on all four faces with a list of rulers and their reign lengths. This is the Sumerian king list, the most complete surviving version of a document that existed in multiple copies across Mesopotamian sites. Its opening line is the opening line of its own ancient title, Namlugal Antai Deabar, after the kingship had descended from heaven. The cosmological claim embedded in that opening is not incidental. The descent of kingship from heaven is the premise of everything that follows the first king. In the first city, Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. The second king ruled for 36,000 years. The reigns before the flood are not meant to be taken as literal historical durations. They are the Mesopotamian way of encoding that these reigns occurred in a different kind of time when the human world was closer to the divine order from which it descended. The exaggerated lengths are a theological statement about the nature of antediluvian existence, not a numerical record of actual years. What the king list establishes as its first act is that human authority, the political and administrative capacity to organise human social life, was not a human invention. It came from somewhere else. It descended. It arrived in Eridu as a gift or a grant from the divine order, and the first humans who exercised it were exercising something that did not originate with them. This places the king list in direct structural conversation with the creation texts. The Atrahasis epic says humans were created to perform labour for the gods. The Enki and Ninmah myth says humans were given individual fates, specific roles and natures recognised by divine authority. The Song of the Hoe says humans were broken from the earth by a divine instrument, and the king list says that the capacity to govern, to organise, to direct, to hold authority over other humans was sent down from heaven as a discrete thing, a transferable property that moved from city to city and from king to king across the antediluvian period. None of these traditions were in tension with each other as far as the scribal archive is concerned. All of them were copied. All of them were preserved. The king list sat beside the creation texts in the same archive, and the student who copied one copied the others. But when you read them together, a picture emerges that is more complete than any single text provides. humans were created with a specific labour function, given individual natures by divine authority, broken from the earth by a divine instrument, and then at some point after their creation, at some point that the king list marks but does not date relative to the creation given the capacity to, govern themselves, which also came from the gods. The first city on the king list is Eridu. This is not coincidental. Eridu was, in Sumerian cosmological geography, the place where the divine and the human orders most directly intersected the city of Enki, located at the edge of the Abzu, the freshwater underground sea over which Enki presided. The Eridu Genesis takes its name from the city. The creation of the first cities in the Sumerian tradition is associated with Eridu precisely because Eridu was understood to be the place where the organisation of the human world was first attempted under divine supervision as an extension of the divine order into the material realm. That kingship descends to Eridu first, in the king list. Is the tradition saying the city where the divine order most directly touched the earth was also the city where human political authority was first granted? The descent of kingship is not a separate event from the creation of humanity. It is its completion. Humans were created in the Atrahasis tradition to perform labour. But labour without organisation is insufficient. It requires management, direction, allocation of tasks and resources. The descent of kingship is the divine provision of the management layer that makes human labour functional at a civilizational scale. What happened to kingship before it descended is not recorded. The king list begins with the descent, whatever preceded it. Whatever the divine order was doing with kingship while it was still in heaven is outside the scope of the document. But the implied logic of the phrase that kingship descended, that it came from above to below, that it moved from one realm into another, carries with it the same structural assumption that underlies all the creation texts. The organising principles of human civilization did not originate in the human world. They were present elsewhere first. They arrived. The powers that existed before the cities among the texts that the Nippur scribal curriculum transmitted with particular care is one that describes, in a form closer to catalogue than narrative, the divine powers, the fundamental capacities that organise civilization. The text known from multiple copies and catalogued in the epistle as the myth of Inanna and Enki provides what is, across its multiple versions, the most complete enumeration of what the contained. The list is long and strange. Gathered in Enki's possession, in his temple at Eridu, the include lordship, the office of priest, the office of Lager priest, descent to the underworld and ascent from it, the sword and its carrying case, the black garment, the colourful garment, the loosening of hair, the binding of hair, the standard, the quiver, the art of lovemaking, the kissing of the phallus, the art of prostitution, the running of the cult, deceit, the holy tavern, the descent of fire, the scribal art, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the carpenter, the craft of the fuller, the craft of the builder, the craft of the reed worker, and on, for well over 100 items. Kingship, law, the descent of the underworld, the art of music, the art of song, the straightforward speech, the deceitful speech, the slanderous speech. What the represent what the text is doing by cataloguing them in Enki's possession before the action of the myth begins, is establishing that the entire infrastructure of human civilization existed as a divine possession before any human city exercised it. Kingship is a law is a the the scribal art is a me, music is a me, carpentry is a me. Every capacity that organised the Mesopotamian world, every skill, every office, every form of social organisation, was in this tradition a property of the divine order, held by Enki at Eridu, existing in that form before any human exercised it. The narrative occasion of the myth Inanna's journey to Eridu, her drinking session with Enki, the gradual transfer of the me to her boat of heaven. Her return to Uruk with the powers, the 7 attempts Enki makes to recover them before accepting their loss, is interesting in itself. But for the creation sequence, what matters is the setting. The me are in Enki's possession to begin with. They were not created by humans. They were not developed by human civilization through long historical experience. They existed whole and complete in the house of Enki before they were brought to the human cities. This is the creation sequence extended into the domain of culture. It is not just that the gods created humans and placed them in a world that was physically prepared, the canals dug, the agricultural species present, the infrastructure in place. The tradition is making a further claim that the capacities through which humans organise their social and cultural life also precede human existence, also originate in the divine order, also descend rather than develop. The scribal art, the specific skill that the students of the Nippur were acquiring, was a me before it was a curriculum. It was a divine possession before it was a human practice. A student who knew the Inanna and Enki myth, and it was part of the standard literary curriculum, was therefore practicing a skill that the tradition understood to have originated with Enki, to have been transferred to Uruk through Inanna's journey, and to have descended from that divine origin into the human world where the student now exercised it. The student's hand, pressing a wedge into clay, was at the end of a chain of transmission that began not in a previous human generation, but in the house of a god. Whether this understanding made the work feel significant or merely obligatory is a question the tablets cannot answer. What it suggests is that the Sumerian scribal tradition had developed with considerable thoroughness. A cosmological account in which not just the physical world, but the entire structure of human cultural capability had its origins in the divine order that preceded human existence. The me were older than the cities. They were older than the first humans. They were held by Enki before kingship descended from heaven to Eridu, before the first canal was dug by Igigi hands, before Ela was killed and the first human body was formed from his blood and clay. The human world, in this tradition, was entirely derivative. Every tool, every skill, every form of social organisation, every capacity for expression and governance and craft, all of it came from somewhere else first. All of it arrived. The shape of the problem at the end of the world, the flood, changes everything in the Atrahasis tradition, but it does not change the sequence. After the flood, humans exist again. The problem that generated the flood, the noise, the multiplication, the disturbance of Enlil's rest, requires a permanent solution that the flood itself, despite its scale, cannot provide by itself. Because any surviving humans will multiply again. Enlil is still disturbed. Enki is still protecting the human line through Atrahasis. The gods must negotiate a new arrangement. The arrangement they reach is intricate, and it is described in the damaged third tablet of the Atrahasis epic, with enough clarity to understand its logic, despite significant gaps in the text. The solution has 3 components. First, certain classes of women will exist who cannot bear children, the barren woman, and women who die in childbirth are established as permanent features of human demography. Second, a class of ritual women, the Pakidatu, sometimes translated as a type of priestess, will be established who do not bear children. Third, and most significantly, a figure called the Pashitu, a demon or divine being associated with infant death, will take some children before they can add to the population. This is the tradition's answer to the noise problem, not elimination, but regulated mortality. The human population will be managed not by the periodic destruction that failed 3 times, but by structural features of human demography that will maintain a balance between the population's growth and the god's tolerance for noise. Death in the Atrahasis tradition is not an original feature of human existence, it is a management solution, introduced after the flood as part of the divine renegotiation of the terms on which humans were allowed to continue existing. This means that the world before the flood was a world in which humans did not die in the ways humans now die. The extraordinarily long reigns of the antediluvian kings in the Sumerian king list, 28,800 years, 36,000 years. Periods that make individual human lives impossible to calculate are, in this cosmological framework, not mythological exaggeration in the simple sense. They describe a world in which death had not yet been introduced as a management tool, in which the human population grew without the structural mortality that would later regulate it, and in which the consequence of that unregulated growth was precisely the noise that led Enlil to the flood. The Atrahasis tradition is therefore telling a story about why humans die that is completely unlike the explanation most subsequent traditions have offered. It is not that death is a punishment for transgression. It is not that death is a natural feature of the biological beings that humans are. It is that death is a policy decision reached in a divine assembly after the flood, as the condition under which the gods agreed to let the human labour force continue operating. Humans die because Enlil needed to sleep. The king list knew this, or worked in the same framework. The antediluvian reigns are impossibly long, the post-flood reigns are long but decreasing, the historical reigns with which the document closes are, by comparison, brief. The arc from 28,800 years to a reign of a few decades is the arc of mortality being introduced gradually, or becoming more effective over time, or simply being the cosmological way of recording the difference between the world before the god's management solution and the world after it. Whether the scribal tradition understood this connection explicitly, whether the student copying the king list in the morning and the Atrahasis epic in the afternoon made the connection between the antediluvian reign lengths and the flood narrative's demographic management scheme is unrecoverable. What is recoverable is that both texts were preserved together in the same archive, and that the cosmological framework they both operate within is consistent enough that the connection is available to be made. What came before the first king the king lists phrase, after the kingship had descended from heaven, contains, embedded in its grammar, a temporal marker that most readers pass over without pausing. After implies a before. If kingship descended at a specific moment, if there was a point at which it came down from heaven to Eridu, then there was a period before that descent, a period in which humans existed, but kingship had not yet arrived. A period in which the human labour force was operating the canals were maintained, the agricultural order was in place, but the organisational capacity that would eventually structure the human world into cities and administrations had not yet been granted. What was happening in that period is not described anywhere in the surviving literature with precision. The King List does not describe it, because the King List begins with the descent. The creation texts do not describe it, because they focus on the moment of creation itself, but the gap is there, implied by the grammar, a period between the creation of humans and the organisation of humans into the political and cultural forms that the me and the descent of kingship represent. The Sumerian tradition appears to have held, at least in some versions, that this gap was substantial. The creation of human beings and the creation of the first city are not presented as simultaneous events. Humans are created to perform labour. Cities are the infrastructure within which organised human labour operates at scale. Between the two, there is an implied period in which humans existed but were not yet city builders, which corresponds with uncomfortable precision to the condition the debate text describes: humans eating grass and drinking ditch water before the agricultural gifts arrived from the Holy Mound. The sequence, assembled from these different texts and read in the order their internal logic implies, runs something like this. First, the gods uncreated, presupposed, second, the Igigi labour economy divine beings building the physical infrastructure of the Mesopotamian world. Third, the failed experiment of the Igigi as a sustainable workforce rebellion, tools burned, the march on Enlil's house. Fourth, the creation of humans from divine blood and clay to take over the labour. Fifth in the gap, the King List implies a period of human existence without organised social structure, the pre-agricultural condition the debate text describes. Sixth, the descent of the me and of kingship, the divine provision of the organisational capacity that makes human civilization functional. Seventh, the antediluvian cities Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar. Shuruppak, the first 5 cities on the King List, the cities that existed before the flood and whose names the tradition preserved. 8th, the flood. 9th, the reconstruction, kingship redescending to Kish, the post-diluvian sequence beginning, the reign lengths compressing toward historical time. This is the full arc of the Sumerian cosmological narrative, assembled from fragments in Philadelphia, Oxford, London, and Berlin. No single text contains all of it. Each text contributes a portion, and what the arc as a whole shows is a picture of human existence as the latest and most managed layer of a cosmos that was already ancient before the first human hand pressed clay. The archive that would not choose the most significant single fact about the Nippur scribal archive, more significant than any individual text it preserved, is that it preserved contradictions without resolving them. The debate texts pre-agricultural humans and the Eridu Genesis's simultaneous creation of humans and animals. The Dilmun myth's world being organised without humans, and the Atrahasis epic's world organised specifically because of humans. The Song of the Hose humans broken from the earth by a divine tool, and the Enki and Nippur myths humans shaped from clay by divine hands. The King List's kingship descending as a transferable property, and the Inanna and Enki myths me being carried on a boat to a city that already exists. These texts do not form a system, they form an archive. And the distinction matters, because a system requires internal consistency requires that its parts agree, while an archive requires only that its parts be preserved. The Nippur scribal tradition was, in this sense, more committed to preservation than to coherence, more committed to keeping every account of the sequence than to producing a single authoritative version of it. This is unusual enough to be worth sitting with. Most traditions that address foundational questions about the nature and origin of existence tend over time toward consolidation. Later interpreters harmonize earlier accounts. Contradictions are resolved or explained away, authoritative versions emerge, and subordinate alternatives. The Mesopotamian scribal tradition, over the period during which these texts were copied and preserved, did not move strongly in this direction. The incompatible accounts stayed incompatible, preserved side by side in the same tablet houses, copied by the same students, taught as the same curriculum. One reason for this may be institutional. The Igigi was not a theological school in the sense of an institution designed to defend and transmit a specific doctrinal position. It was a scribal school, an institution designed to produce scribes capable of copying, composing, and administering texts across a range of genres and traditions. Its commitment was to textual competence rather than theological consistency. A student who had copied the Atrahasis epic faithfully and the Dilmun myth faithfully had demonstrated the scribal competence the school was designed to produce, regardless of whether the two texts could be reconciled. Another reason may be that the tradition understood the questions the texts raise as genuinely open in a way that resisted resolution. If the question of what came before humans, and why humans were created, and what their place in the cosmic order is, if these questions admit of multiple answers, each of which is partially true, then preserving multiple accounts is not a failure of theological coherence, but an accurate reflection of the question's complexity. The archive that preserves contradictions without resolving them may be an archive that understood complexity better than resolution. What the student copied, working through the standard curriculum in the Nippur Igigi in the early 2nd millennium BCE, was not a doctrine. It was a conversation that had been going on for centuries before the student arrived and would continue for centuries after. A conversation in which the question of the human place in the created order was approached from multiple directions simultaneously, with the understanding that no single direction was sufficient. That conversation is what has survived. Not the answer, but the practice of asking. The broken tablet in Philadelphia is its most fitting emblem. The portion we have is enough to see the shape of the question, enough to know the kinds of answers the tradition reached for, enough to understand that the sequence gods first, labour second, humans after, culture arriving last from divine possession, was a framework within which the question could be held without being closed. The King list in Oxford ends at a point that is, by the standards of the tradition that produced it, almost contemporary. The last dynasties it records are dynasties whose historical existence is archaeologically confirmed, whose cities have been excavated, whose administrative records survive. The ark from after the kingship had descended from heaven to the last historically attested king on the list is the ark from cosmological time to historical time, from the period of impossibly long reigns to the period of human-scale governance, from the antediluvian world organised by divine decree to the world the scribes themselves inhabited and administered. The student in the Igigi was at the near end of that arc. The gods were at its far end. Between them, stretching back through the antediluvian kings and the flood and the labour economy of the Igigi and the primordial deliberations of the Anunnaki on the Holy Mound was the sequence that the archive preserved in all its productive inconsistency, the sequence that said, again and again from different angles and in different literary forms, that the world was old before humans arrived, that the infrastructure of human existence was built before humans were created to use it, that the very capacity for civilization was a divine possession before it became a human practice. To understand this is not to diminish the human story. The Sumerians, who preserved this cosmological framework more carefully than any contemporaneous tradition, were also the people who invented writing, who built the first cities, who developed the first known legal codes and administrative systems and literary genres. Their sense of human lateness in the cosmic sequence did not produce a culture of resignation. It produced a culture of extraordinary creative intensity, as though knowing that you arrived after everything was already arranged freed you to work within that arrangement with precision and ambition, rather than the anxious originality of a species that believes itself to be the first cause of everything. The student pressing wedges into clay in the Nippur was working within a framework that told him the skill he was acquiring was older than he was, that the civilization he was being trained to serve was organized on principles that descended from heaven before his city existed, that the world he inhabited had been built and maintained and troubled and nearly destroyed and reconstructed. Before his particular version of it began, he was the latest arrival in a cosmos with a very long prior history. The texts said so. He copied them faithfully. Whatever he thought about, that whatever passed through the mind behind the tired hand on an afternoon in 1650 BC, copying the same lines for the third time before the master was satisfied, is the one thing the archive could not preserve. The wedge-shaped marks in the clay are there. The thought behind them is not. That absence may be, in its own way, a continuation of the pattern the entire archive records. The most important part of the sequence is always the part that did not survive.